We are live here. This is Rabbi Shawn on behalf of Mishkan Shalom from Mishkan Shalom Shtiebel here in Mount Airy while our building is still closed, but we have never closed our community. And Live and Learn is a new summer offering where we've been dealing with topical issues of our time. First few sessions have dealt with people's own personal journeys and journeys at Mishkan Shalom, as well as taking a look at racial justice and larger sustainability issues. And to that end, I'm so delighted that Sara Katz is here today from her hometown. And Sara, I'll let you introduce yourself. Tell us, a little bit about yourself and your own, journey with yourself, family, and coming to Mishkan as an opening volley. And then we'll get into all the other juicy stuff.
Okay. And you'll tell me what I'm forgetting to say.
Okay.
If I don't hit it. So I'm Sara Katz, coming to you from my home in Fairmount, where I have lived since 2002. I grew up in Lower Merion on the main line, and left that area for college and some time after college for working, and then came back to Philadelphia to go to Penn Law School, and that is where I met my husband David, who I guess some of you heard from a few weeks ago. And I've been back in Philly ever since. I haven't left, so I consider myself to be a Philly girl. I guess in terms of my Jewish journey, which is kind of, I guess, interwoven into the rest of the story. I grew up attending Mainline Reform, which is a very large suburban Reform congregation, like thousands of members. And I grew up very connected to my Jewish identity and very connected to my synagogue, at least in terms of my synagogue leaders. I think I had sort of like deeper relationships with the rabbis and the cantor and my Hebrew school teachers than I probably did with the kids, because it never quite felt socially like a community for me, which I think was a lot of just my experience growing up on the main line, of feeling like maybe this wasn't the most diverse or the right fit. And it's a lot of what kind of guided my decision to go to Columbia for undergraduate, because I was really seeking like the city life and the diversity that I thought would come with being at Columbia, which certainly Columbia is a very diverse place. Maybe what I didn't anticipate is it also was a place that I became probably even more deeply connected to my Jewish identity and what that meant, because I also really experienced Jewish diversity. Because Columbia, of course, with its relationship with Jewish Theological Seminary, had its share of people that were studying to be rabbis and Jewish educators, that were in a joint program, and my classmates to some extent. And so on the one hand, I met people who were far more observant than I was, both Orthodox and conservative. But I also sort of met a gamut of folks who sort of were more culturally connected to their Jewish identity. And there was, to be involved in Jewish life at Columbia, it meant anything from attending services to attending Israeli dancing classes and kind of like everything in between. And so it in a way really opened this door within, even though it opened a lot of doors in terms of, a sense of the diversity of the world and sort of what New York City had to offer. It also really opened sort of my view of what Jewish life had to offer. And I sort of inadvertently ended up living slightly more observantly because I was a vegetarian at the time. So I ended up living with people who kept kosher and, sort of, and kept Shabbos, and, and so it sort of, it changed kind of the whole dynamics of my sort of how I practiced and how I was living with some other folks that were more observant than I at the time. But all of that's to say that then, sort of fast forward to getting to Penn Law School and meeting David, in terms of what led us to Mishkan. I mean, when we were dating, I mean, we both used to say, and I think Cindy will probably know what I mean when I say that we called Penn Law Junior High, that it was sort of felt like it was a fishbowl. It was really, really small. And so when David, who was the president of the Black Law Student Association at the time, and I, who was, head of the public interest student group, started dating, we really kept it quiet, and we were not, really broadcasting that to the world, so much so that by the time we graduated, I'm not sure our class, like a lot of our classmates didn't know that we were together. But I think, throughout the time that we were dating and as we started talking about marriage, we always talked about how it was really important to me that that we have a Jewish household, that we have a Jewish family. And David was very much on board with that. And so because that's something that we had very much talked about a lot, actually, we joined Mishkan about a month after we got engaged, because we felt like we needed some way to kind of give voice to, like, okay, we have this intent, we're going to have this Jewish household, we're going to have this Jewish life, but where are we going to do that in a way that's going to feel comfortable and accessible and inviting for both of us? And I always say we didn't synagogue shop, we just found Mishkan and joined. So, but that's sort of the story.
Sarah, can I ask you in that journey, especially given the times that we're living in, and I'm hearing, of course, I know some of the story, but it's wonderful to hear some of the details or the expansion of even things that I knew, your journey and your journey with David, which you've spoken of actually, a couple times at Mishkan as a couple, in your journey as a multiracial, multi-faith family and so on. But I was taken by the aspect of the fishbowl, and and we're kind of keeping it like low key at that time, and just once you were through that process and then joining the larger world, or even finding a community like Mishkan, that I'm wondering what that was like for you. And certainly one could say at the time and now. On one hand, here we are, and so many things have not changed, and
Right.
and racism and white privilege is still so prevalent, and at the same time, many things have changed. So I'm just wondering about that aspect of the journey when you said, okay, here we are, world.
Right. I think, there were people in our lives and in our communities writ large that were not supportive of, learning that we were together, right? It was sort of, on the one hand, I certainly don't want to speak for David, but I think for him, being the president, being in this sort of public role of leading the Black law students at the time, we knew, and it came to be true, that there were certain members of the Black community who just weren't comfortable with the idea of him being with a white woman. And certainly in my world, certainly in my immediate family, there was some pushback of being with someone who was not Jewish, and it was sort of, but also not white was kind of more the tacit underwritten piece of that. It was sort of, well, the objection, what was being said out loud was, he's not Jewish, but I think some of the implicit implication was, and he's not white. And that was a lot to navigate on a personal level in terms of my own family relationships. His immediate family was much more supportive and welcoming than mine was. I think as we've sort of moved through the world, not to say that there haven't been moments, but some of it is, we have created a community for ourselves that is comfortable. We purposely seek out diverse places where we will be welcomed together. So the times where it doesn't feel comfortable are usually, honestly, I think although I experienced my own level of a little discomfort entering majority Black spaces, I think I'm more welcomed in those spaces, and have experienced less like direct kind of pushback in those spaces than I think David has at times when we've been in majority white Jewish spaces in particular. Certainly visiting certain synagogues, where, sort of this man in a suit and a kippah is looked at, sort of askance, or, even my own children, right? So we've definitely had those experiences, but again, like, it's mostly been in sort of, certainly, again, not at Mishkan, in other sorts of white Jewish spaces where it hasn't necessarily felt comfortable.
I'm just sort of thinking of myself as somebody who maybe viewing this a little bit later, given the years that you've had at that, is there some things, and David spoke to, in the other program, to his comfort and what, and I know even at Mishkan, people of color, particularly Black Jews or people who aren't Jewish but are Black as well, have had a range of, some unconscious bias, well-intentioned but nonetheless microaggressions, or, and David was clear, in this form as well, saying he hasn't had those experiences. So, even just because one fits a certain identity marker doesn't mean you uniformly have the same experience in the same place.
Sure.
When you share that. But is there anything from your perspective that you found most helpful to, when you look back on now, how you navigated some of those tensions and came through them that way?
I think so. I mean, sometimes you can confront it, right? There's something to confront. It's hard to confront a sort of strange look you get from across the room, for example, right? And I can think of examples of, sort of like feeling stared at in other synagogues we visited, for example, when we've been there as a family, like for a bar bat mitzvah or, that sort of thing. And that feels strange because there's not as easy a way to kind of figure out how to navigate it. Because what do you do? Just stare back, right? It's sort of, as opposed to sort of confronting something that's said explicitly, which has its own sets of challenges.
Right. Well, now that you have those two additional dues paying members of your own household, actually, no, you pay for them. They don't pay dues for you.
One day.
one day, hopefully so. So what has remained the same and what has changed that now that you and David are raising these two wonderful little beings? Not so little.
I mean, again, like I've sort of, I've had the experience of coming back to mainline reform where I grew up, and sort of, unlike Mishkan, where you know well, Shawn, that, like Eliana runs up and down the aisle in the middle of service and everyone thinks it's adorable. It's not seen as, acceptable behavior, for example, so I've had challenges like going for one of the services for holidays with my mother, and people, looking askance if she's getting in and out of the seat or squirming around. I mean, I think I had a similar experience with Micah when he was younger too, of sort of just like even the expectations of behavior and kind of, like, oh, you must not know, we stay quiet during the, so I've had experiences of having to like leave the service and not participate because, it's sort of, again, my kids aren't accustomed to having to sit quiet and in a straitjacket and, during a service. So I can't pull that off, but, but I don't know. I mean, I think we're in a new phase right now for, our children are 3 and 10. Micah, I think actually most people, I think everyone on here sort of knows my kids, that, Micah is a strapping, tall 10-year-old. He looks more about 12. And so, we've hit that phase of like, he's just at that point where people talk about like, when does my Black son become a scary threat, right? And I think we're right at that, like, he's almost as tall as me, and he's, he's tall and he's getting bigger, and that's a scary thing to think about, how he sort of navigates in the world and creates a new set of concerns in terms of sort of how he navigates even Jewish spaces, right? Where, sort of now he looks like a young man, as opposed to, or at least he's getting there, right? As opposed to a little boy. And
it sounds like those.
I think I had been, I had been vocal about it when sort of, post the Tree of Life shooting, and there was all the talk about, kind of increased security and sort of what that would mean for my husband and for my son, or for my children generally.
The side of profiling or other things like that, that suddenly, because of the assumption that the, Ashkenazi normative, or white presenting Jews, etc., and anyone who isn't is somehow looked at a little bit differently, and how to balance those things.
Exactly. And even just sort of, I mean, some of what's unfolded in sort of the public media over the last week or so, with some, high profile celebrities making anti-Semitic remarks and kind of navigating the space of kind of, there's been a lot of pretty painful discussion about, sort of, you know, critiques that Black folks aren't sort of stepping up to criticize their own enough, where there have been anti-Semitic remarks made, and the sort of pitting of the, is it sort of Blacks and Jews together or Blacks versus Jews, sort of assumes those are two separate groups, and they aren't always, right? And so there's a lot of sort of, I mean, it really is actually kind of white supremacy kind of integrated into like sort of the assumption that these are two distinct groups that we have to talk about whether they fit together or apart. And so it's been hard to figure out how to kind of navigate and wade into some of those discussions because of that, I think.
Since the number of public lynchings and murders have taken place, of course, with the most visible and dramatic of George Floyd, there's also been within the Jewish world the rise of question how are Jews of color, or Black Jews in particular, being given voice and at the table, and so much more is being written. And we at the Clergy Caucus at Power, our interfaith justice network they're a part of, we had this conversation yesterday, which I so appreciated. As Jews and the leader of the Black Clergy Caucus, and sort of saying, okay, how do we respond? What is our response in this? And what are we missing, and what should we be saying? And avoiding the piling on, or the demonizing of individuals. And for me, I increasingly go to some of the Black Jewish commentators, on various social media platforms, who themselves walk this tension that's different than being, a multiracial family and having both your experiences together, and giving voice to some of those, pieces as they navigate, or they're LGBTQ, Black, Jewish, and sort of add the hyphens to all the identities that someone is navigating, and they get more complex along the way. So I actually really appreciate you saying that, and us watching to not fulfill that white supremacy hope, which is that by pitting ourselves against each other, we will then erase any challenge to white privilege and the institutionalized racism and anti-Semitism that way. So I see that both as the tension, but also the opportunity that some of the dialogues have created, and the dialogue within not assuming white normativeness within the Jewish community, almost like an additional track that hasn't had voice before, or families like yours, or kids like yours as well, having a voice at the table to say, well, I'm navigating a multiplicity of things. We can't make this a reductionist conversation and think that we're going to solve it that way or come to some greater understanding. So now I know that I'm wondering if we can segue from this to the work you do kind of on the ground, which I would love to hear a little bit more of, because I know some, but I don't know it all that way, that you went from being a student at Penn to now you're teaching, and I'm wondering, like, what is it like to be in that environment of law and the intersection of some of these social, issues as they impact you in your own teaching and professional life?
Well, I mean, I'm someone, there's a great irony that I now teach law school, and then, I'm a law professor because, when I graduated college, the one thing I was absolutely sure of is I did not want to go to law school. I had a lot of people in my ear saying, oh, but you argue and you're so persuasive, go to law school. And I said, absolutely not. And I think the main reason that is because I only knew corporate lawyers. Any lawyers my parents knew all did, represented big corporations or did big business transactions. And I knew that didn't interest me. And, in college, I was an activist, right? And when I graduated, all I wanted to do was be an activist. And really what I did go and do, I worked as a community organizer for several years in low-income communities in New York City. And as a result of being a community organizer, I met public interest lawyers, and sort of discovered this whole world, which of course Cindy's nodding because she knows, because she was in it at that time, but I didn't know these people existed, right? I didn't know there were lawyers that represented poor people at legal services agencies. I didn't know that there were lawyers who were working on systemic advocacy to make change, make uh, systems less oppressive, right? And so it opened my eyes to the point where I finally realized, wait, I do want to go to law school because I want to be that person. Like, I want to be the person who's rewriting the laws and, making things more equitable. And so it is why I went to law school. Um, and when I graduated after clerking for a judge for a year, I came to community legal services, and I represented parents in child abuse and neglect cases. I was defending parents who were either having their kids taken away by the government or at risk for having their kids taken away by the government. And my clients were almost exclusively women of color, who were really being targeted by the government and having their family. I mean, we don't talk a lot about the foster care system as really being a system of family separation here in the United States, but that's what happens, right? And we have, there's a ridiculous racial disproportionality with regard to the kids who are in foster care. So that, Black and brown kids are far more likely to be removed into foster care, far more likely not to get the services they need to help keep them in their homes with their parents, far more likely not to go home to their parents than their white counterparts. And, it was sort of that realization that drew me to the work. And, unfortunately, 20 years later, it's not that much different than it was then, despite, various systemic reform efforts.
You're still advocating for the same
That
population?
shifted a little. So I was at community legal services for 8 years. And while I was there, I started teaching as an adjunct professor at Temple and actually at Penn as well, teaching a child welfare law class. And that created an opportunity initially for me to just take a 1-year leave and go direct the family law clinic at Temple Law School, but that turned into an opportunity to stay. And so I've been a clinical law professor for 8 years now at Temple. And so I direct a clinic where students take a class with me where they learn all about the substantive law and the procedural law, but they also learn, all kinds of practice skills. They learn about trauma-informed practice, they learn about cultural competency, and they learn about, how to be effective advocates, but they put those skills to the test right then and there because they're actually representing live low-income folks in Philadelphia in family court, and I'm supervising their work doing that. But then, in my role now in academia, what I get to do is also sort of sit at tables to, help advise on systemic advocacy. I write and I research and write about these topics. So those are all the different, sort of pieces of what I do.
Well, just let me get one more in there and then I'll open it up because I'm sure not the only person who might have an additional question for you. But given so much of it is, right, who's in the room, who gives voice. I was on a call yesterday. It's been wonderful to see some of the responses since the spring and different groups popping up. There's a whole protest chaplains network of clergy that developed around the protests, and that, we've been called upon to accompany people, to form rings of support, to be witnesses, and so on. But there's also a group that's a more expansive group that's developed out of that, particularly with younger folk than I. But I was at the second call of this group on how to support reparations for Black people in this country, particularly of African American, lineage, and how to do that on a micro level within one's own purchasing and economic investiture, as well as on a communal and systemic, area, and articles coming out about that. But so much of it is, like I notice in these tables, is not only being aware of gender identities, sexual orientation, as well as culture and race as it's defined, and so on, but also who's not at the table, and how can we, if this stakeholder group is not represented, can we actually legitimately go further in our discussing that way? You may have dealt with that, some of that as like, welcome. It's so great to have the first woman on this panel talking about women's support networks and that, like some of that, breaking through the glass ceiling on that level. But I'm wondering what you're seeing, given you're at the table and you're seeing so much of this on the ground, what things can you see in this moment in time of ways of shifting the system and not just being always in that reactive mode to the way things are?
Well, I think some of it is actually, and I loved I'm going to mangle the Mordecai Kaplan quote about the sort of the past gets a vote, but not a veto. But actually, what I was thinking about as you were talking about that was sort of this notion of like so much gets perpetuated because we always have done it this way, right? So when I think about, and there's been, sort of in my world again, like in the child welfare world, there have been things written of like, sort of we're talking all about police brutality, but we're not talking about sort of government brutality with regard to families. And that's what the child welfare system perpetuates. And, when I say like it's been, it's like 20 years later and it's the same way, it really is true. And it's in part because all we've done is little tweaks, right? We tweak, but it's like, well, we've always done it this way. So we know this is the problem. So we're not going to change it too much. We'll just, sort of be more incremental about it. And I think that some of the opportunity of these sort of chaotic times that we're living in is starting to really like hear those voices and, and that there are other ways in which the government perpetuates systemic brutality on its own people, on Black and brown people, and we need to look at all of those. It's not just the police, and we need to it's the child welfare system, it's housing, right? I mean, there's blocks from where I'm sitting right now, there's the housing, the Black Lives Matter housing encampment, right? They're taking over a baseball field, and it spreads into so many different areas. And I think that this is an opportunity to start hearing those voices and to sort of, say, okay, well, we have to look across the board. And just because we've always done it this way actually isn't really a good excuse for continuing to do it that way. And I think I really mean that on the macro level and the micro level, right? And so, that it's in terms of like broad systemic policy change, but it's also in terms of just like our little interactions and all the, you mentioned microaggressions and, and none of us are immune, even like the most, I mean, I think particularly all of us here are white, we all have to be sort of open to the fact of being called on the white supremacy that lives in us because we've all been raised with it. And it's hard to eradicate that. And so we don't always even know what we're doing or saying. I mean, coming back to some of the events with celebrities making, anti-Semitic comments, I got into a really interesting discussion yesterday with actually a Black friend of a friend on social media because she had posted an article about, Viacom boots Nick Cannon within 3 seconds, but the cops who arrested Breonna Taylor, haven't been arrested. And, my initial response was, well, why does it have to be either or, right? Like, why can't it be that these anti-Semitic comments are unacceptable and we need to arrest but, she made the good point, and we had a really nuanced discussion about it, that hate speech is not the same as racist systems, right? And so the sort of harm done by these comments is a harm. I mean, it's absolutely a harm. And also Black people keep getting killed by the cops without repercussion. And that's, and that's it is sort of a false equivalency to kind of make them the same. And that's where we got into this discussion of Blacks versus Jews versus the alignment and all, but I do think, yes, it needs to be both. Like, yes, Nick Cannon needs to be called out and those police officers need to be arrested yesterday and then some. But, I think we all have to be open to being checked on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's part, and I mean, it makes sense to the degree that I feel in the thick of it. So it's not like, oh, here's the packaged answer, but, and there's
Hmm.
a nuance in terms of Deshaun Jackson, which is different than, you know, Nick's comments or standing by, or the ability to do teshuva, to rethink one's position and become educated, and then not relinquish the other oppressions or get into whose pain is greater.
Right,
You know, and that race to who's got the greater oppression, in which nobody wins
right.
at, and then
It doesn't get us anywhere. And that was my response as well. Like, we, you know, this isn't, we don't want to devolve into oppression Olympics, but there is also, and we don't want to devolve into oppression Olympics, and there's a difference between speech and systemic. So,
Well, I'm wondering if, because I know I could keep on going with
right.
Sara right now too, but just to pause for a moment and see if anyone wanted to unmute themselves and had a, you know, question or comment. Susan, looks like you got something there. Okay, were you unmuted? It looked like you were unmuted. So
yeah, I unmuted myself. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm just appreciating listening and thinking about. I've been doing Torah study on.
And thank you for responding to some of the, you know, the comments there, Sara. I'm wondering where. What for you is some sense, as you've heard yourself speak. I hope you will. I'll make the link too, because it's been absolutely wonderful. And I find myself amongst many of us who learn a lot when we find out what we've said, you know, not always in the saying of it. So I hope you'll get something out of your own words. But where does this conversation bring you, or are there any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave people with, you know, based on your own life and personal and professional experience?
I don't know. I think that the some of what we're touching on, and just in terms of like the being open, the recognition of, you know, sort of the white supremacy living in us, that like no matter how sort of egalitarian or you know, justice oriented we each all are, we all can kind of slip up too. And maybe not now with sort of such intense focus in the world right now on these issues, but it's easy to get complacent and sort of assume like, oh, I'm woke, I'm good, I, you know, of course I do right in the world. And I think the moment we let us kind of get there, we can actually cause a lot of harm, right? You know, and so I think, you know, for myself, just to make it personal and concrete, you know, I mean, you know, I'm married to a Black man, I'm raising, you know, kids of color. I think it's easy to sort of assume for myself that I'm fine, you know, like that I'm completely sort of have got this right, and I really don't have all the answers. And I can certainly, if we had more time, talk about really concrete ways in which I've messed up the work of being a good ally as a white person. And that can be really embarrassing and kind of shameful, you know, shaming. And so one choice is to get really defensive, and that's like, you know, sort of the Robin DiAngelo white fragility, you know, piece of this. But one answer is really to be open to know that we're all still a work in progress. And so, and it's sort of never too late to keep doing that work. And so this really is sort of an ongoing exercise in undoing white supremacy and furthering the work of anti-racism. So I'll leave it at that.
And I think we can leave it at that too. I think you know, dropping the mic on your last comment is probably a good way to circle back, and just appreciating you so much, Sara, for just who you are in the world as a person, and you know, the change that you try to be and teach other people who are going to be people going into the world advocating for others. It's a very powerful field in this turn of time and of generations. And so just really appreciating you spending the time, and those of you who have joined us, and those of you who will be listening down the road. If you hadn't seen the other episode with Graciela Saransky-Poe, who was my first guest of the first session, there's some interesting you know, overlays and different perspectives, both for her as someone born in a police state in Argentina, who's, you know, generally presents white-ish, let's call it that, you know, in terms of her own cultural background, and then coming to the States, marrying an African-American man, having two biracial kids, and so on. So I just recommend taking a look at that, as well. And I want to just conclude in a prayerful way, as we've been trying to do in this series. We began with a rendition of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah Melody to Psalm 150. And so I wanted to end with the story I said I was going to end with, and the fact that Psalm 150, the last psalm in the canon of psalms within the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible itself, ends with Kol Hinashama Hallelujah, hallelujah. Every soul has its own particular way of praising you. And hallelujah, you are the aggregate of all these souls as well. And if any of them are diminished or dismissed, then the divine field is lacking or reduced as a result of that. So the quick story, Sara, in honor of your journey in law and your teaching in terms of social advocacy law, etc. So back to the ideas of halakha we talked about at the top, meaning a way, the indefinite article. If we have those of you who are familiar with your Christian Bible, or yourselves who are familiar with church or Christian, when Jesus says in the Gospels, I am the way, he's actually using those terms, like you can get a greater understanding of halakha through me, in that way. So if you know the parlance, you understand what's being discussed, even within that emergent understanding of halakha, because he also says one letter of the law will never change. So you can pluck from his saying, I'm not saying he was a Kaplanian. I'm just saying that, like Mordechai Kaplan said, the past has a vote. Like, it will never go away. It is at the table. It must be respected and incorporated. And also this halakha, this way, this path that we are going on, will continue to be part of the evolving religious civilization of the Jewish people. So the quick story from the Talmud, and it's much more juicy to give you all the details, but the quick story is there's a debate on whether an oven is kosher or not, the oven of Anak. And one of the sages is saying, there's no problem. There's these different separations. There was this on this level and this on that level. It's fine, it's kosher. And the entire Sanhedrin, the Rabbinic Academy, pretty much is against this idea. And I think it's Rabbi Eliezer who's bringing this case forward. And he says, well, if I am right, then let the stream outside this building reverse flow. And the stream stops and it goes back. And all the other rabbis say, that's great, that's wonderful. God bless the stream. We still disagree with you. I mean, well, if I am right, then may the carob tree explode outside the Sanhedrin, and suddenly there's carob, beans are flying everywhere. People are ducking underneath tables, and they all get back up again. And that's wonderful for the carob tree, but we disagree. And he goes on, and finally, if God's presence herself is in alignment with me, let God's presence, the bat kol, the voice of the divine, come down. And suddenly the Sanhedrin fills with this voice, I am in alignment with my child, my son, Rabbi Eliezer. And then one of the other sages stands up and quotes the Torah back to God by saying, Lo b'shamayim hi. It is not up in heaven or so far across the sea, but it is in our own hands and our own hearts. That's what you said. I'm quoting you back. And God withdraws and says, I have to side with the Sanhedrin then. They quoted myself back to me that way. And that story doesn't end there. It ends centuries later in the Stargate Atlantis wormhole that the Talmud is, that suddenly switches time periods, when one of the sages is walking suddenly with Elijah, right? So this is my way of pushing back at that of Jewish law. It's not just the legal code. Suddenly we have a case study, and suddenly Elijah, the portent of the Messiah, is walking with somebody in the due course of a day on the way to Wawa's or something. And the sage says, that story? Can you tell me, Elijah, how did God respond to that? And Elijah says, oh, God said, finally, my children have defeated me. This is the moment I was waiting for, when they would take it into their own hands and hearts and not just quote something that had preceded them. So this is even within the depths of the tradition, this dynamic of dealing with the changes in culture and time, dealing with our emergent understandings, dealing with law or halakha as a dynamic evolution and not just something that spoke to a certain period of time and therefore stays frozen in that time. So thank you again, Sara, for enabling us. The other rabbinic saying, hafochba, turn every letter around and in it you'll find different combinations. I know hearing from you today, amplify your story and share your perspectives. I'm walking away changed by this conversation, and I thank you so much for being the change that you seek in your life.
Thanks so much for the opportunity, Shawn.
Thank you very much.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Kol Neshama Hallelujah. Keep singing your songs. Everyone has a note.
Will you share with us the YouTube?
Yeah,
address
right now I'm compiling. Basically, let me just see